in regards to basically the theory plays out that the offensive line position is the most difficult one to develop in regards to 17-year-old kids becoming grown men a couple of years later and developing the bodies to play at this level. And then, of course, the cohesion and coordination of the offensive line unit, how difficult that is. But you actually put some measurements to it that, again, just kind of reinforced what makes sense in this transfer portal era and how difficult it is to piece together an offensive line that's going to play well together.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating, right? Because I think that we've all seen across college football in the past 5 years or so with the transfer portal and NIL, there's never been more movement than there is right now in the sport. But I think that in so many ways, that's emblemized, I guess you could say, by the offensive line, because ultimately this is a position group that requires 5 players to act as one. It's a position group that takes multiple years to develop. I had multiple people tell me that they feel offensive line is probably the most developmental position in all of football because of one, what you have to do from a body perspective, getting, a kid who might be 270 pounds coming out to being 310 pounds of muscle at playing weight. And then the other piece of it as well is, again, the actual coaching of how to block, of how to be in the right position, of how to communicate with linemen around you, and how to understand a professionalized scheme like you're going to see at this level. And so when you start bringing players in and out so much more haphazardly, it's just harder than it's ever been to not just get 5 guys who can play at a high level, but to get 8 to 10 so that you have a true, deep developmental offensive line room.
Shahan Jayaraja joining us from CBS Sports, breaking down college football for us and the latest, obviously, on the national landscape with the settlement we'll get to in just a second. But you actually, with the offensive line situation, made some strong indicators. It's not like there was exhaustive information or volumes that would prove it, but I think it makes total sense. And you pointed to some of the units that have stayed together that actually proved that with the number of starts that they had at their one school after 3 or 4 years, that they were some of the best offensive line units in the country. And the flip side is that the deterioration of some of these units and guys scattering all over the country took some of the better offensive lines and then certainly deteriorated their performance.
Yeah, well, and one metric that I used was I looked at teams that were finalists or semifinalists for the Joe Moore Award, and the number of those lines that have 5 homegrown prospects is pretty remarkable. Like, I think last year there were 8 finalists or semifinalists for the Joe Moore Award. And between those 40 starting players on the offensive line, only about 6 of them were transfers. And the only teams that had multiple transfers on their line were, I believe it was Oregon and Tennessee. Everybody else had 1 or fewer transfers. And the ultimate winner, Army, who of course had a great season last year, was all homegrown players. And I think that even you look at some of the other teams that went deep in the college football playoff, Texas was a fully homegrown offensive line. Notre Dame was a primarily homegrown offensive line. And I think that ultimately there's never been more focus on just being able to keep guys around. And, I got a chance to talk to Miami offensive line coach Alex Mirabal, who's considered one of the best in the sport. And you look at the way that Miami's trying to build their roster, and especially the way that they've grown over the past couple of years, they have been a team that really wants to be a homegrown program. They've only taken 1 transfer a year to maybe add some depth, maybe, somebody who can compete for a starting job. But they have, whatever it is, 16 offensive linemen in a room, and just about 13 of them are kids that they recruited out of high school who they want to be there for multiple years. And I think that long-term is a strategy that's going to serve a program like that well.
And I got to think that that's going to amplify the need for the high school recruiting to be in play and strong along the offensive front. And then obviously, as we have found out from the transfer portal era, it's not just imperative to go out there and supplement your roster or overhaul your roster if you're in certain locations, but also retain the players you already have and kind of resell the program to them and keep them in the door. And then there's also the factor that if you have poor offensive line play, then your skill position players, and especially the quarterback, are more likely to get injured.
100%. And one point that was brought up to me during this process was, look, here's the reality of the situation when it comes to college offensive line play versus even you look at the NFL. Ultimately, you're in a position where if you give up a negative play, whether that be a tackle for loss or a sack, it almost is guaranteed to end your drive at the college level. Like the percentage of drives that end with a punt and not with points whenever you give up a negative play, it's much higher than it is in the NFL. It's something like 75% ultimately end up going nowhere at the college level. And so when you have, like, that's the thing. The margin for error on the offensive line is so much smaller than it is for really any position. And I even include quarterbacks in that. If you give up 2 sacks in a game, that's a miserable game. It doesn't matter if you blocked 65 snaps. If you have 2 bad ones, that's kind of like all it takes to maybe cost your team a game. And when you start getting to second and third order effects of this, whether it is, a guy maybe miscommunicating, a guy not understanding the technique or where he's supposed to be, a guy not necessarily trusting the guy beside him and overcompensating somewhere else, like these things start to add up. And I think the other point too is that when you talk about sort of the super lines that we had in the 2010s, early 2020s with the Alabamas, the Georgias, like it's just harder to keep those guys on campus for multiple years. Again, it's not that hard to have a good 5 at the top, especially for a program like that, but it's really 6 through 13 is where you cost yourself the most, because ultimately you just can't keep those guys on campus before some team's going to come out and try to buy your backups away from you.
Well, Shahan, we appreciate you bringing this to light, putting some metrics to it, confirming it, because we've said here for a long, long time at the Voice of College Football, the offensive linemen they're the guys, they're like the umpires in Major League Baseball. As long as they're doing their jobs, nobody cares, nobody notices, nobody mentions their names. They'll just kind of blindly say, Alabama's got a great offensive line or Georgia's got a great but nobody ever names their names. Unless they obviously miss a tackle, or they're obviously called there at the stadium if there's a hold or an illegal procedure or something, and then you put data behind it. So it was a great read, and I want to bring attention also to Minnie Hunt, who led me to that article. But